Happy Halloween and welcome to episode 53 of No Rares Required, a weekly podcast where I go over a specific color pair or archetype, specifically in draft, with the aim of helping you draft infinitely so you can collect all of the cards in the set. And this week we're going to be covering Dimir Faeries. And I use Faeries lightly because I don't think you should actually lean too heavily into the Faerie synergies because there are some traps. My best success has been to either do a tempo or a control strategy, utilizing the evasive flyers, using some of the Faeries, and cheap removal or counter spells, and it's not uncommon to have a relatively low creature count in this archetype. And one of the things that you can do, I don't recommend dropping lands below 17, just because you are looking to use your cheap removal while also playing and developing the board. So it's not really, you don't have a whole lot of really great threats to be strictly aggro, so keep that in mind. And the other thing, too, is I think you should be mostly black. I think blue is, the more blue that you are, the less power that you will have overall. There are some strategies that you can lean into in blue, and we will cover those. But the more black cards that you can pick up, the stronger your deck will be. So with that, let's dive in. So the top performing common in Dimir is Candy Grapple, and it is the best black common, right? It's amazing cheap removal. And then I think it performs best in Dimir because it has bargain synergies as well, and so you can pair it nicely with Hatching Plans. But I don't typically want the Hatching Plans strategy. It's kind of more of a backup, as we'll get into. But one of the things that works really well with this is for the tempo-based strategy. So being able to remove one of your opponent's plays while also still continuing to develop the board has been very impressive. Hopeless Nightmare is also one of the top performing black commons in Wilds of Eldraine, and I think its best archetype is Orsov, white-black, because of stockpiling Celebrants. Being able to bounce this, triggered the scry, off of stockpiling, and then play it again to make them discard again and lose 2 life has just been really impressive. But anytime that I'm in black, I'm looking to pick up Hopeless Nightmare. And we've got Spell Stutter, which I really like in the Izzet and Dimir control strategies. So if you're leaning a little bit more into the tempo-based strategy, then I'm not as happy about having Spell Stutter. And one of the things that I'd like to mention is that as far as like managing how much interaction or how much removal you have in your deck, if you're going for like a really aggressive tempo strategy, you can get away with having 5 pieces of interaction. And I don't count Spell Stutter towards those 5. Instead, I like to count it towards the 8 that I like to have if I'm playing more of a control strategy. So take this with that in mind, that if you're playing a really aggressive strategy, you won't want to be countering your opponent's plays, or it becomes a little bit more awkward to do so if they get through, or you're developing early in the game. And then so Spell Stutter is better if you're planning to just keep the 2 mana open and play a very reactive game. One of the things that you can do is take advantage of the fact that this card is available on the wheel, and so take it after pick 8. And then we've got Into the Fate Court, which I like slightly better in Izzet, where the plan is to win strictly through card advantage. And you can, so the more controlling that you're leaning and the more spells that you have, because you can kind of think about the pace of your deck based off of how many creatures are you actually playing, right? So your threats are what are going to actually close out the game. So the more threats that you have, the more fast your tempo is going to be, as long as those are low-costed creatures. So Into the Fate Court is a little bit more towards I'm going to respond to everything that you play. I'm going to play the Spell Stutters. And, I'm going to eventually win by just 1-for-1ing everything that you have. And then I've had more cards than you. And so I'm left with the advantage, right? So one of the things I did consider replacing into the Fey Court with Rat Out, because I think my draft skeleton leans pretty heavily into the tempo strategy, and the double pip in blue can be problematic. But I really have enjoyed Into the Fey Court anytime that I am playing with blue, and so I decided to keep it in. And you do get a 1/1 fairy, so there's a little bit of fairy synergy. And this is another card that you can take advantage that it wheels, and you can take it past pick 8. And we've got Borrow Naughty, which I consider the cornerstone of Dimir Faeries. And most of the fairies in Wilds of Eldraine don't benefit greatly from having multiples. And this is the exception, because it gets lifelink as long as you control another fairy. All of the other fairies work pretty well just standalone. But this is part of the payoff of getting multiple fairies in your deck is Borrow Naughty. But I do think, and as I'll mention later, there are some traps as far as leaning heavily into the fairy synergies. But when you get multiple fairies going, these can just seal the game for you, especially if it comes down to a race, because racing lifelink is just so impossible. We've got Spell Stutter. Oh wait, sorry. I already covered that one, my bad. Sweet Tooth Witch, I've really enjoyed. I think its best archetype is Dimir, and it works well for both tempo and control strategies, and as well as bargain strategies if you do go down the road of playing hatching plans. And so the reason why I really like Sweet Tooth Witch as one of my top commons in Dimir is because the food is really great in a race where you're attacking with flyers, you're using the evasiveness of your flyers to get damage in, and so you're not really blocking, right? And so a lot of times it comes down to who can deal the most damage the fastest. And then if you are stuck, eventually they set up their own flyers that block your flyers. They play some late green reach creatures. Then you can use a bunch of your food synergies to ping for 2 damage with Sweet Tooth Witch. And it has definitely helped me win a couple of games. And then we've got Rat Out, which I mentioned. I like more if you are leaning more heavily into an aggressive strategy in Dimir and less so in control, because sometimes this just doesn't hit very well, right? Like if you're up against green and they're playing a bunch of things that aren't X1s, then Rat Out is kind of just like a miss. And so you kind of want to take inventory of how many creatures you are running, and the higher amount of creatures that you are running, then the more that I like Rat Out, especially because as a combat trick, if they use a 2/2 to block your Sweet Tooth Witch, for example, you can use Rat Out to remove, even if it is greater than a toughness of 1. And also take advantage of the fact that this card wheels, and you can often pick it up past pick 8. Candy Trail, I've really enjoyed in Dimir, and I think Dimir is its best archetype. So it can be bargain fodder in a pinch, and it can be life in a race. But where I find it to be particularly nice is because of the evasive creatures. And Dimir Faeries it plays out a lot like white-blue flyers in the other sets, where you're just you're racing in the air, you're pressuring your opponent. And so if you're playing this tempo strategy, then being able to scry your early draws and make sure that you don't stumble, because if you stumble, your tempo is called tempo for a reason, right? Your early plays set the pace for you to win the game. So the scry is really good, especially because you're not really planning to do anything on turn 1. And then similar to the Sweet Tooth Witch, the food in general, just being able to gain the life, has helped me win a lot of the races against my opponents. And then it's always good to cover some backup plans, like if black is not as open as you want it to be for the draft skeleton. There's some good options in blue. And Diminisher Witch I've really enjoyed, especially if you're doing the hatching plans strategy, but it also synergizes really well with Sweet Tooth Witch. So even if you don't have the hatching plans, you can use this as quasi removal, make their biggest threat into a 1/1 while you're attacking in the air, and it kind of slows the pace of your opponent down. And you can take advantage of the fact that this card wheels. And then similarly, Johann's Stopgap. This one I leaned a little bit more into, like, I really only want to make sure I hit the 5 bargain count if I have a hatching plans strategy, right? I mean, we've covered bargain blue strategies before in Izzet and in Simic, and I think overall they do the hatching plans strategy better than Dimir does, but it's always an option, right? So if you end up in the hatching plans path in Dimir, then Johann's Stopgap is a great option. And you can play it just for tempo, right? So like if you're in Dimir control, you don't really want this because it doesn't answer your opponent's thing, it just stalls. But if you're playing aggressive cards and trying to close the game out, this is really good for getting rid of a problematic blocker for your flyers. And it's card neutral, right? So it draws a card when you play it. So I've enjoyed this one in Dimir, but certain types of Dimir. And then similarly, Ice Out is really good with the hatching plans strategy. The only downside is that it has a double pip in blue, which makes it difficult if you are going to be playing this in a mostly black deck. So the more blue that you have, the stronger Ice Out becomes. And you can take advantage of the fact that this one wheels. And then Monstrosity, I've really enjoyed in every black archetype. I think that the fact that you get a food token for it if they have a rat out or a flick a coin, then it kind of makes up for the fact that it's a 3/1. And it works really well in the tempo-based strategy, right? So if you're doing control, it's a little less important because you're eventually going to win the game, so the early pressure that Monstrosity gives you isn't as advantageous. But being able to play a 3/1 on 2, and then on your later turns, use your counterspell to prohibit their plays, and use your removal to clear the path, Monstrosity can get in for some early damage, and then when it does die, it gives you food synergies, which I think work really well in this archetype. And then Conceited Witch, I think, goes unlooked a little bit in Dimir. If you're doing the control thing in Dimir and just trying to get as much removal as possible, then this is not as important. But if you're doing the tempo flyer strategy, then the Wicked Roll is great to put on a flyer. And the more that you are playing your Hopeless Nightmares and making your opponent discard and trading 1-for-1, you create what, like, I've heard Sam Black call a small game. And the smaller the game is, the less pieces on the board, and then the better Menace is. So I think it works quite well in the Dimir strategy. And then we've got Feed the Cauldron, which I've been kind of down on Feed the Cauldron. I covered it in Simic because I think it has some really interesting applications in Simic. But in black, usually there's better removal. But food is so good in Dimir that I think of all of the black archetypes, Feed the Cauldron performs the best in Dimir. And so keep that in mind, that food is particularly important in the tempo strategy because it helps you race better. Your flyers, because they're evasive, tend to have a little bit less power than your Rakdos or your Boros counterparts that you might be racing. So the food becomes so critical. If you're leaning really heavily into the control archetype, then this is a little bit less important because it doesn't trade up in value. It is always a 3-cost spell that destroys something that's 3 or less, but you still want as much removal as possible, so I often find myself playing it even in control. And then we've got Diminisher Witch, which I already covered. I've got a couple of duplicates in here this morning. And Ice Out's already... Okay. And now for the uncommons, we've got Shrouded Shepherd, which Dimir has 2 mythic level uncommons, but both of them are splashes, which is kind of interesting. So Dimir doesn't have as good of fixing as Izzet does because red has a whole bunch of treasure makers, but you still have cards that can help you fix in Dimir. And if you have the opportunity to play these 2 mythics specifically, I think they make really good splashes at uncommon. The first one is Shrouded Shepherd, and if you can't find the splash, it still works as a pretty good removal. -1/-1 to your entire opponent's board can just single-handedly destroy certain strategies like the Rakdos Rat Blast deck. And then being able to play a 2/2 later in the game that gives your flyer or your evasive creature with menace, as long as you can get that 2 damage in when this enters the battlefield, then I've been really impressed with it. So it's okay it's okay to find later in the game once you finally find your white source. And then similarly, Gingerbread Hunter has also been a top performing uncommon. Because it plays as removal, and then later once you find your flash, it fits into the strategy, right? So food is really good and just gives you this kind of late game threat if you weren't able to close out the game with your flyers, and then also gives you some food that you can use with your Sweet Tooth Witch to ping for 2 damage, and just all around, Gingerbread Hunter has been an amazing uncommon. And then we've got Picklock Prankster, which the best archetype for Picklock Prankster, I think, is Dimir. Since similar to Izzet, you are generally a very spell-heavy archetype, and you also have additional fairy synergies in Dimir. Since you can hit an instant, a sorcery, or a fairy, most of your deck fits that category. And Picklock Prankster has just been fits into the flying tempo plan particularly well. And we've also got Fairy Fencing, which found no surprise there is best in Dimir, because you really need fairy synergies to make this card shine. If you're just playing out Fairy Fencing as a heat ray, it's always going to trade down in value, right? You're going to spend 6 mana to destroy something with 5 toughness. But when you have a fairy, you get an additional -3/-3, and that's huge, right? So you can pay this for 1 and give something -3/-3, or scale it to take out a larger threat, as long as you have a fairy. And so like this one, if you're not running the fairy strategy and you're just going strictly into the control strategy, then it's a little less impressive. So keep that in mind, that this gets better the more fairies that you have in your deck. And then we've got Witch's Vanity, which I've found, similar to the Hopeless Nightmare, is best in Orzhov because of being able to bounce it back for value with Stockpiling Celebrant. But it's good in every black archetype and is a really great for the tempo-based strategy for cheap removal that gives you a food token, which I've stressed is particularly important in this archetype. And then being able to give a flyer a Wicked roll makes it so that your Borrow Naughty is a 2/4 base instead of a 1/3 base, which is much more of a threat that will actually close out the game. And then we've got Spellscorn Coven, which I've really liked with the Hopeless Nightmare. The more that you already have them discarding, the better Spellscorn Coven becomes. The more likely that you're going to be able to get your opponent to be hellbent and have no cards in hand. And you also get the fact that it's a fairy. And the only time that I've ever found myself actually using the take it back side of the adventure is in Dimir. Because you don't have to, it's not good enough to go out of your way to splash blue for it. But being able to remand their spell back to their hand has been, it has won me some games. And then, like I mentioned at the beginning, you can go the Hatching Plans route. Anytime that you're in blue, Hatching Plans is a possible way to go, because blue itself has enough bargain to make the strategy work. But I do think that Dimir is its worst archetype, and the only really good bargain card in black is Candy Grapple. And if you compare this to Torch the Tower in red, and Hamlet Glutton or Agatha's Champion in green, and also the fact that you can just play Candy Grapple in Simic and in Izzet, there's really no strict advantage to Dimir. And but you might be like, what about High Fae Negotiator? And it does come with bargain, but I think its best archetype is in Golgari or in Orzhov, since it's a 5-drop, and you're not really going for that mid-range strategy, right? You're either leaning more into control, and then this is okay in the control strategy because it can close out the game, but it's almost an inferior version to Archive Dragon, since it's just easier to remove with the 5 toughness instead of 6 and without the ward. But it does have fairy synergies. And the only thing that I found is that food is often better used for the life gain than it is for bargain. And this is, if you're going to sacrifice the food for life gain, this deals 3 damage as well. So it does work well if you have food lying around. but I don't think you need it for, like, I'm trying to figure out the best way to describe it, right? Like, the bargain synergies aren't that great or that critical, I've found, in Dimir compared to Izzet, where bargain is like a core part of my plan. And with that, though, we can lead finally into the rares, where we start to see a lot of the good fairies. So one of the traps is going all in on fairies, and it's because things like attendance, where you can use the adventure side to give the -4 to their power, are better when the creature dies from the combat trick in trades. And if you're giving something -4, it's generally a larger creature, and so you need something like Simic, where you're going to be using it to change, like 2 gingerbread hunters clash, and you give one of them -4, and so yours beats theirs, and it's useful, right? Whereas if like you're just using it to soak up 4 damage and the creature remains afterwards, then it's not particularly good. And then similarly, like Dream Spoilers, the 2/2 flying fairy for 4 that gives something -1/-1 whenever you cast a spell, is an absolute trap of a card, right? It can line up nicely if you're up against like Rakdos Rats, but like most of the time playing a 2/2 flyer for 4 is just too little. You're not getting enough bang for your buck. And so the other thing too to point out is that many of the fairies don't need additional fairies to be good. So case in point, Talion's Messenger doesn't need additional fairies. If you have them, it's okay, because like when you play it, if you have a fairy and you can attack with it, you immediately get the value of looting and its effect. But it also triggers itself. So if the only fairy in your deck is Talion's Messenger, it's going to be perfectly fine, because you still have this 1/3 that becomes a 2/4 that triggers a loot and just continues to grow. And then we've got Hornblock Whale, which I've really enjoyed in Izzet and in Simic. And for Simic, because you're playing this like 6-drop that has the adventure side that I discussed last week, is like advantageous to maximize that side of your deck. And then I've really enjoyed it in Izzet for the control aspect of it. So the more that you are like an Izzet control deck in Dimir, then the more that I value the Hornblock Whale, right? And it's pretty good in the tempo-based strategy too, where you're just trying to disrupt your opponent's plays, and so bouncing something that they're pressuring you with is a great solution. You just, like with the tempo strategy, you're not really looking to maximize your 5 and 6 drops. So playing it for the flash side as the 6/6 with Ward 2 is just going to happen in less games. And then we've got Sleep Cursed Fairy, which I've found best in Dimir and Azorius. And Azorius is the last archetype to cover, so I'll talk more about it next week. But in Dimir, it fits well into what you're trying to do, right? You're playing a 3/3 Ward 2 that is going to start being able to attack on turn 4. And if you're holding up counter spells and they don't play anything worth countering, you can take one of the stun counters off of Sleep Cursed Fairy. And then it's also a fairy, so it gives you additional synergies if you're following this up with like a Borrow Naughty on turn 2. And then we've got Twining Twins, which I've found to be best in Izzet and Dimir. Just anything where you're aiming to disrupt your opponent's plays. The more that you're leaning towards a control strategy, then the more powerful this Twining Twins becomes. Because you need a win condition. You need something that can close out the game. And a 4/4 flying vigilance with Ward 1 is perfectly fine. And you're not really going to be splashing as much as you will be in Izzet, so the white side of the adventure comes up less often, but it's still been a particularly nice fairy to play. And then we've got Gumdrop Poisoner, which has been amazing in every black archetype, but I've really liked it in Dimir, and I think Dimir is its best archetype. The importance of food, I will stress again, and if you're trying to gum up the board with gumdrops, being able to play something that basically gives you 6 life, right, is really good to slow down your opponent's pressure while you're winning in the air. And so often they just can't attack into your 3/2 lifelinker because you'll gain too much life, and it's just been a very impressive card. And we've got Lord Skitter, Sewer King, which is worth a mention in Dimir, but I found it best to be best in Rakdos, where you have rat synergies, and best in Golgari, where you kind of are leaning more into a typical mid-range strategy and being able to build up a threat of 1/1 rats over time. This doesn't gum up the ground very well because the rats can't block, right? So the longer the game's going to go, though, then the more that you're going to be able to leverage the rat synergies for bargain, which I think green does a little bit better because of like Agatha's Champion and Hamlet Glutton. You can still make Lord Skitter work quite well in Dimir, but you're going to really want to lean more off of getting payoffs from those bargains. And now for the mythics, we've got Virtue of Persistence, which is a fantastic black mythic. It's great in every black archetype. If you open this up, please take it. Giving something -3/-3 until end of turn and gaining 2 life is absolutely great at disrupting aggro strategies from your opponent, and is good enough that like you see this card in constructed play, right? Like this is a fantastic one. And then if by some means you end up actually making it to turn 7, like if you're a very grindy control deck, being able to reanimate creatures from your opponent's graveyard as well at the beginning of your upkeep is just a way to just inevitably win the game, right? So it's one of the best win conditions for control. And then we've got Ashiok, Wicked Manipulator, which has been a great card, great mythic in every black archetype. But I like it specifically in Dimir Control and in Dimir Tempo. And I think Dimir is its best archetype. And so either in Control, you're using the fact that like you can just Ashiok is a win condition, right, in and of itself. But the reason why I like it is in Dimir too is that because you can also be doing the tempo strategy like my Draft Skeleton, and at that point being able to create a 1/1 create 2 1/1 bodies gums up the board so incredibly well, right? The fact that this creates 2 blockers every single turn, and then like you just can really slow down your opponent's pace with this, especially because they will be pressuring the Planeswalker instead of your life total, because they're worried about Ashiok just going unchecked and taking over the game. So even if this just creates 2 blockers and takes the pressure off of you for a turn, that can be enough to win in the air in the tempo strategy. And then we've got Talion, the Kindly Lord, which is best in Dimir because you don't have to splash for it. And, it's a 3/4 flying fairy for 4, so it's pretty decently statted. And then when it enters the battlefield, you have to choose a number between 1 and 10. And whenever an opponent casts a spell with that mana value, power, or toughness, that player loses 2 life and you draw a card. So the debate, there's pros and cons between choosing 2 or 3. Those are your best options. And if you want the full breakdown of why it's those numbers and what the slight differences between them, I highly recommend that you go watch Sirkovitz on YouTube. So look for Magic Numbers is the name of the podcast, and they do an excellent job breaking down the stats during each set. And they have a whole section that's just about what number to pick for Talion, the Kindly Lord. So check it out. And then we've got Bitter Blossom, which is the last mythic, last card that I will cover. And just to really point out how little the fairy synergies actually matter, Bitter Blossom performs the worst, according to 17 lands, in Dimir. The worst black archetype for Bitter Blossom is Dimir. Now, with a grain of salt, right? It's still a game-winning card. If you play Bitter Blossom on turn 2, you will usually win that game. But part of the reason, like, tempo itself is not really the best way to win by playing Bitter Blossom, because if it is a race, this thing is pinging you for 1 damage every turn. So that can end up making you lose, right? So thanks for watching to the end of the video. I hope it helps you get those trophies and draft infinitely. I post multiple videos a week, so remember to hit like and subscribe for more Magic the Gathering content. We only have 1 archetype left, Azorius, before the Lost Caverns of Ixalan, so that will be covered next week. And thank you all for the support, and happy Halloween!